The year is 524. In a fortress prison near Pavia, a man named Boethius sits on a cold stone floor, iron shackles biting into his wrists. Just months earlier, he had been one of the most powerful men in the Western world, a Roman consul, a scholar fluent in Greek philosophy, trusted advisor to Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy after Rome's fall. Boethius had spent his life translating Aristotle and Plato into Latin, believing he could preserve the wisdom of a dying civilization for ages yet to come. Now he waited to be executed for treason, a charge he insisted was fabricated by jealous rivals at court. Everything he had built, his reputation, his family, his future, had collapsed in a matter of weeks. And yet, in this darkest hour, stripped of every honor Rome had ever given him, Boethius picked up a pen. What he wrote next would outlast the empire that condemned him. To understand the shock of his fall, you must understand how high he had risen. Boethius was born into one of Rome's oldest aristocratic families, a world of marble villas and inherited privilege. But he was no idle nobleman. He was obsessed with ideas. He mastered Greek at a time when few Romans still could, and set himself an almost impossible task to translate the entire works of Aristotle and Plato into Latin, so that Greek philosophy would never be lost to the West. King Theodoric, though himself an outsider ruler of a fractured Italy, prized Boethius for his brilliance and appointed him to the highest civil office in Rome, Master of Offices. Boethius stood at the very center of power, admired, respected, seemingly untouchable. He believed his life's purpose was philosophy in service of the state, reason guiding governance. It was a beautiful vision, and like most beautiful visions built on the favor of kings, it was more fragile than anyone imagined. The accusation came suddenly, almost absurdly. A senator named Albinus was charged with treasonous letters to the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. Boethius, ever the defender of justice, spoke up for him in the royal court, arguing that the evidence was thin, the accusation politically motivated. It was a fatal mistake. Within days, the accusation turned on Boethius himself. Rivals whispered that he too conspired with Byzantium, that he sought to restore the old Roman Senate's power against Gothic rule. There was no real trial in the way we would recognize one. King Theodoric, aging and increasingly paranoid about threats to his fragile kingdom, ordered Boethius arrested without ever hearing him defend himself in person. The man who had spent his life pursuing rational truth was condemned by rumor, fear, and court politics, the very forces philosophy was supposed to guard against. He was dragged from his home in Rome and imprisoned far away, awaiting a sentence already decided. Here is the detail almost no one expects. Boethius was not executed quickly. He was held in that prison cell for months, not knowing the exact day his death would come. Imagine that suspended horror. Every sound of footsteps outside the door might be his executioner. Every night might be his last. Stripped of his titles, separated from his wife and sons, robbed of the vast library he had spent decades building, he had nothing left to distract him from his own mind. Most men in that position would have spiraled into despair, cursing fortune, cursing the king, cursing the gods for abandoning him. Boethius did feel that despair. He wrote of it openly. But something unexpected happened in that cell. Without power, without audience, without any external reason to keep thinking clearly, he began the deepest philosophical work of his entire life. The very isolation that should have destroyed him became the condition for his clearest thought. In his despair, Boethius imagined, or perhaps genuinely experienced in a fevered state, a visitor. A tall, radiant woman appeared to him in the cell, her robe embroidered with a Greek letter pi at the hem and a theta near the collar, symbols for practical and theoretical philosophy. She called herself philosophy itself, personified, come to console her old student in his final hour. This was no comforting fantasy meant to distract him from pain. She began, instead, by scolding him. She told him he had forgotten who he truly was. He had spent his life studying the cosmos, the nature of the good, the structure of virtue, and yet here he sat, weeping over the loss of consulships and country estates, as if those things had ever truly belonged to him. It was a jarring, almost cruel opening, but it was exactly the confrontation Boethius needed to hear, and exactly the one most of us still need to hear today. Lady Philosophy's central teaching came in the image of a wheel, the wheel of fortune. She told Boethius to imagine fortune herself speaking. I turn the wheel that spins. I delight in raising the low and bringing down the high. Climb up, if you like, but understand, it is a condition of my game that you will eventually descend. Fortune, she explained, never promised stability. Wealth, power, titles, even reputation. These are not things you truly own. They are things you borrow, spinning on a wheel that was never designed to hold still. To rage against fortune for taking back what she lent you was, philosophy said, like being angry at rain for being wet. The only honest question was never why did fortune turn against me, but rather, what did I mistake for permanently mine? It was a devastating refrain, not comforting in a soft way, but liberating in a hard, clear-eyed way. This is where the story sharpens into paradox, and it is the paradox almost no textbook fully sits with. Boethius, the man who had spent his career serving power, now had to conclude, from inside a death sentence, that power itself was never the source of a good life. If happiness depended on titles, they could be stripped away by a king's whim. If it depended on wealth, it could vanish with a rival's accusation. If it depended on reputation, it could be destroyed by rumors he never got to answer in court. Every external good Boethius had spent his life accumulating turned out to be, by its very nature, unstable, subject to fortune, subject to other people's decisions, subject to chance. The only thing that could not be seized by soldiers or condemned by a court was the ordering of his own mind, his own judgments, his own inner clarity. He had built his identity on the wheel. Now, dying, he finally saw the axle beneath it. What makes this moment remarkable is not just the insight, but the discipline with which he wrote it down. Boethius did not scrawl a bitter confession or a plea for mercy. He composed, in alternating prose and verse, a structured philosophical dialogue, testing objections, working through logic, refusing easy comfort. He asked philosophy the hardest question of all. If God is good and providence governs the world, why do the wicked so often prosper while the innocent suffer? He was, after all, living proof of that very injustice. Philosophy did not dodge the question. She walked him through the difference between providence, the eternal plan, and fate, its unfolding in time, arguing that what looks like chaos from inside a single lifetime may be part of a larger order invisible to us. Boethius never fully resolved his own execution as fair, but he found, in the act of reasoning itself, a dignity that no verdict could touch. The book he was writing had no title yet, but history would come to call it the Consolation of Philosophy. It is worth pausing on how strange this document actually is. A condemned man, hours or days from death, produces not a religious tract, not a legal appeal, not even a mention of the Christian faith he was known to hold in his other writings, but a purely philosophical dialogue rooted in Platonic and Stoic ideas about virtue, fortune, and the highest good. He does not perform piety for an audience. There was no audience. No one was going to read this before he died. He wrote it, it seems, simply because thinking clearly was the last freedom available to him, and he intended to use it fully, to the very last page, to the very last breath he had control over. Then came the end. In 524 AD, the sentence was carried out. Ancient accounts describe brutal methods, a cord tightened around his head until his eyes bulged, or a club used to beat him to death. Historians differ on the exact detail, but all agree it was neither swift nor merciful. Theodoric, the king who had once honored him, allowed his execution to proceed on the word of accusers. Boethius was never permitted to properly confront. Rome's greatest living philosopher died as a convicted traitor, his name disgraced, his family scattered, his fortune seized by the crown. If you had asked anyone in Pavia that year whether Boethius's ideas would matter in 1,000 years, they would have laughed. He was, by every visible measure, a defeated man, erased by the machinery of power he had spent his life trying to serve wisely. And yet here is the turn history itself delivers, better than any writer could invent. The Consolation of Philosophy did not die with him. It survived, copied by monks through the collapsing centuries of the early medieval world, becoming one of the single most read books in Europe for the next 1,000 years. King Alfred the Great of England translated it into Old English by hand. Geoffrey Chaucer translated it into Middle English. Queen Elizabeth I, centuries later, made her own personal translation of it during long nights of political crisis strikingly similar to Boethius's own. Dante placed Boethius in paradise in the Divine Comedy. A man executed as a disgraced traitor became, quietly and almost invisibly, one of the most influential philosophical voices in the Western world, not despite his death sentence, but because of the book that death sentence forced him to write. Deepest irony sits quietly at the center of this story. Boethius spent his healthy, powerful years translating other men's philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, believing that was his contribution to history. It was only when everything he valued was taken from him, when he had nothing left to lose and no audience left to impress, that he produced something entirely his own, something that would outlive every consulship and every king who ever ruled Italy. His greatest work was not written in the safety of the Senate, but in the total absence of safety. It suggests something uncomfortable and true, that clarity about what actually matters often arrives only when the things we mistook for essential are stripped away, whether we choose that stripping or not. So what does this ancient prison cell actually offer someone scrolling through a phone today, worried about a job, a reputation, a bank account, a relationship that feels unstable? Boethius would say, look closely at what you are actually afraid of losing. Is it something fortune lent you? Money, status, other people's approval, circumstances entirely outside your control? Or is it something that is genuinely yours? Your capacity to reason clearly, to act with integrity, to keep thinking well even when the wheel turns against you. He is not asking you to stop caring about your career or your relationships. He is asking you to notice, honestly, which parts of your identity are borrowed from fortune's wheel, and which parts would remain even if the wheel spun all the way down tomorrow. Here is the exercise Boethius' story leaves you with, and you can do it today, in 5 minutes, with nothing but a pen and paper. Write down 3 things you currently feel define your worth: a title, a possession, an opinion someone holds of you, anything. For each one, ask honestly, could this be taken from me by circumstances entirely outside my control? If the answer is yes, you have found something on the wheel, not the axle. Then write down one thing about yourself that no verdict, no rumor, no lost job, and no failed relationship could take away: the quality of your judgment, your honesty, your capacity to keep thinking clearly under pressure. Boethius discovered that quality only in a death cell. You do not need to wait for a prison to find it. You only need to ask, calmly, today, what part of you is never really fortune's to give?